The wind in the Arizona territory of 1881 had a voice, but it was not one that Elena Hart could hear. She knew it instead as a sculptor of the red dust, a relentless artist that carved waves into the dunes and sent shimmering veils of crimson across the single, wide street of dry water. The town was a place caught in a vice, with the promise of Baron Silas Creed's railroad pressing in from the east and the vast, encroached lands of the Apache stretching westward into the haze. The sun baked the land into a hard-pan crust during the day, and the nights brought a cold so profound it felt as if the stars themselves were chips of ice. Elena felt the cold now, even with the midday sun overhead. She stood before the small mirror in her room, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool links of a silver chain coiled around her wrist. It had been her mother's. It was a tangible piece of a past she could not remember hearing, a quiet weight that promised dignity in a world that often offered her none. Her goal, a secret she held tight as a prayer, was to live a life where she was not defined by the sound she missed, but by the substance of her character, a life where she could be listened to, in her own way. She watched her reflection, her eyes sharp and intelligent. They were her ears. They saw the subtle purse of a shopkeeper's lips that meant the price was firm. They saw the slight shift in a person's shoulders that betrayed a lie. They saw the way the Joshua trees writhed in the wind, their twisted limbs a silent scream against the empty blue sky. She could not hear the jingle of a mule's bell, but she could see the dance of light on the polished brass as it moved down the street, and in her mind, she gave it a color, a rhythm, a place in the world. Far from the dusty confines of dry water, Tazani sat on his horse at the edge of Blue Mesa, his gaze sweeping over the valley that was the soul of his people. He was a man in his early 30s, with a stillness about him that seemed to draw from the ancient rocks. His face was calm, his eyes holding the long view of a leader whose duty was to justice and the honoring of promises. In these chaotic times, with the world shrinking around his people, his simple aim was to preserve their freedom, to hold fast to a code of honor that the encroaching world seemed to despise. A dagger with a handle of polished mesquite rested at his hip, its sheath intricately carved with the swirling patterns of clouds. It was a reminder that a man's honor, like the sky, should be vast and clear. That same code of honor was a foreign concept in the White Oak Saloon, the beating, liquor-soaked heart of dry water. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap cigars. Baron Silas Creed sat at a corner table, a man whose tailored coat and clean fingernails were an affront to the grit of the town. He was the railroad, the silver mine, the future, and he moved with the unshakable certainty of a man who did not buy things but simply took ownership of them. His voice was a low rumble, a sound of money and power that cut through the saloon's clatter. Leaning against the bar, Sheriff Pike watched Creed with the eager, dull-eyed devotion of a well-fed dog. His badge was merely a piece of tin Creed had allowed him to wear. His job was not to keep the peace, but to enforce the Baron's will. A grizzled prospector, his face a roadmap of hard luck, swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Heard the iron horse is aiming straight for Blue Mesa," he said to the man beside him, "cutting right through the heart of it." His companion, a lanky cowboy with a nervous twitch, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the spittoon. "That's Apache land, sacred land, they say. Tazani won't stand for it." "Tazani doesn't have a say," a third man interjected, his voice loud with saloon-bought courage. "Not when Baron Creed wants a straight line to his silver. Progress waits for no man, red or white, or—" The saloon's owner, a formidable woman named Maudie, wiped down the bar with a damp rag, her expression sour. "Progress," she muttered, just loud enough to be heard over the murmur. "Looks a lot like greed from where I'm standing. All you fools are talking about land and silver, but you are not talking about the real entertainment." The men turned to her. Maudie jerked her chin toward the street. "The wedding. Sunday. That's the only topic worth your breath." A ripple of cruel amusement went through the group. "Ah, yes," the loud man said with a smirk. "Thomas Hale is finally hitching himself to the Hart girl, the silent one. Heard she is as deaf as a post. the cowboy added, a sneer forming on his lips. What's a man want with a wife who cannot hear him call her to bed? The prospector laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Maybe Hale likes the quiet, or maybe he likes the favor it will buy him with the Baron. The Hart family has that last plot of land Creed needs for the depot. Across the room, Thomas Hale heard them. He stood near Creed's table, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, a man trying to look important while feeling profoundly small. He was to be Elena's husband, a respectable match on the surface, but beneath the starched collar was a coward, an opportunist who saw this marriage as a rung on a ladder. He offered a weak smile in Creed's direction, hoping for a nod of approval, a sign that his sacrifice of marrying a broken woman would be rewarded. Creed ignored him, continuing his conversation as if Thomas were nothing more than a piece of furniture. From the window of the dressmaker's shop across the street, Elena saw it all. She saw the shape of the words on the cowboy's lips, words like deaf and silent one. She saw the ugly twist of their laughter. She saw Thomas, her fiancé, standing near the source of all the town's trouble, looking diminished and weak. She felt the vibrations of their heavy boots on the boardwalk through the soles of her own shoes, a dull, rhythmic thumping that echoed the unease in her heart. The laughter was a silent movie, a pantomime of ridicule, and she was its unwilling star. Each smirk, each knowing glance, was a small stone thrown at her. She did not flinch. She simply watched, learned, and filed it away, her resolve hardening like clay in the Arizona sun. The next 2 days passed in a slow, suffocating crawl towards Sunday. The townsfolk spoke of the wedding openly now, not as a celebration, but as a curiosity, a diversion from the dust and the boredom. It would be a fine show. They wondered how she would say her vows. They wondered if she would even know when the ceremony was over. Their whispers were a language she could not hear but understood perfectly. Sunday arrived, clear and hot. The sky was a vast, unforgiving sheet of blue. The wind had died down, and the red dust settled on everything, a fine powder coating the church pews, the brim of every hat, the petals of the wilting flowers clutched in the hands of the town's women. The church was packed. It smelled of dry cedar, old hymnals, and the faint, cloying scent of perfume struggling against the ever-present dust. People crammed into the pews, their faces turned toward the entrance with a collective, hungry anticipation. This was not a congregation, it was an audience. They had not come to witness a holy sacrament. They had come to see the strange bride, the deaf girl who was marrying Thomas Hale. They had come for the part where something would surely go wrong. Elena stood just outside the heavy oak doors, her father's arm tense beneath her hand. Her dress was simple, a fine white cotton that felt cool against her skin. The silver chain was on her wrist, its familiar weight a small anchor in a sea of staring eyes. She looked past her father, past the threshold, and saw them, a theater full of faces. She saw the smug satisfaction on Sheriff Pike's face in the front row, next to the imposing figure of Baron Creed, who watched with the detached interest of a man observing an amusing, insignificant play. She saw the pity in the eyes of some of the women, an expression she hated more than their scorn. And she saw the open, undisguised curiosity of the children, who pointed and formed silent questions with their mouths. She drew a slow breath, feeling the sun on the back of her neck. She could not hear the organ music that had just begun, but she could feel its low, resonant vibration through the wooden planks of the porch. It was a tremor, a warning. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and she, the silent spectacle, was about to make her entrance. Her father squeezed her hand, a brief, tight signal of encouragement, and then they stepped through the doors. The wall of faces hit her first, a sea of them. All turned in her direction. Elena kept her eyes forward, focusing on the altar at the far end of the long, narrow room where Thomas stood waiting. He was flanked by his parents, a stiffly proud couple who looked as though they had been carved from unyielding oak. Earlier that morning, from her window, she had watched Thomas in his parents' yard, pacing back and forth, He had been practicing his vows, his lips moving with exaggerated precision. She had read the words easily, even from a distance. To have and to hold, for better, for worse. The words had looked hollow then, a performance for an audience of two. They looked no more sincere now as he offered her a tight, rehearsed smile. The air in the church was a character in itself. It carried the scent of old wood and dry dust, a smell as timeless as the desert outside. Beams of sunlight thick with dancing motes of dust slanted down from the high windows, illuminating the scene like a stage. As she walked, Elena's gaze swept the pews. She did not need to hear the whispers to know their content. She saw the words forming on the lips of a woman in a floral bonnet, deaf bride. She saw a rancher lean toward his neighbor, his shoulders shaking with silent laughter. She saw the mockery in their eyes, the pity, the raw, uncharitable curiosity. Each glance was a tiny needle prick. She absorbed it all, her expression serene, her back straight. She had learned long ago that the best defense against such things was a placid exterior, a calm that gave them nothing to latch onto. The rumors had been circulating for weeks, carried on the same wind that brought the red dust. The Hart family would be looked upon with favor by Baron Creed if this union took place. The small parcel of land her father owned, the last piece needed for Creed's new rail yard and depot, would be purchased at a generous price instead of being taken for nearly nothing. It was a transaction dressed up as a wedding. Thomas, an ambitious clerk in Creed's mining office, would get a promotion. Her family would get security. And she, Elena, was the currency being exchanged. She understood the arrangement. In a town like Drywater, survival was often a matter of making the best of a bad bargain. She reached the altar. Her father placed her hand in Thomas's. His palm was damp and cold. He avoided her eyes, looking instead at the preacher, a kindly man with a deeply lined face who now looked profoundly uncomfortable. The preacher cleared his throat, the movement of his larynx visible to Elena, and began the service. She watched his lips, following the familiar words of the ceremony. The sounds were absent, but the meaning was clear. He spoke of union, of devotion, of two souls becoming one. The words floated in the dusty air, beautiful and empty. Elena focused on a point just beyond the preacher's head, a small crack in the plaster of the far wall. She thought of the silver chain on her wrist, its cool, steady weight, dignity. That was all she asked for, a small measure of it. She could endure the stares and the silent mockery if, at the end of this performance, she could build a life where she was seen as a person, not a curiosity. Then came the moment. The preacher turned his kind, troubled eyes to Thomas. The light from the window caught the nervous tick at the corner of Thomas's mouth. The preacher's lips formed the question, the one that would bind their lives together. "Do you, Thomas Hale, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Thomas took a breath. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the eye of Baron Creed in the front pew. Creed gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, a final command, a release. A slow smirk spread across Thomas's face. It was an ugly, triumphant expression. He looked directly at Elena, ensuring she could see him, ensuring she could read every syllable of his betrayal. The words formed on his lips, clear and cruel. "I cannot marry a person who does not know how to hear their own name." For a heartbeat, the world was utterly still. The dust motes froze in the sunbeams. The only movement was the slow, final turn of Thomas's smirk into a sneer of contempt. And then, the sound came, not as something she heard, but as something she felt. It started as a low tremor in the floorboards, a vibration that traveled up through the soles of her shoes and into her bones. It grew rapidly, a violent, shaking wave. The laughter, it was a physical force, a brutal impact that rocked her where she stood. A man in the back threw his head back and roared, his entire body convulsing. A woman covered her mouth, but her shoulders shook uncontrollably. It was a dam of stored-up cruelty bursting forth. At that exact moment, A sudden gust of wind slammed against the church, forcing the heavy oak doors to fly open with a crash that no one inside even noticed. The wind howled through the sanctuary, whipping at Elena's simple white dress, making it tremble as if it were alive and afraid. The sudden, violent motion caused her hand to jerk. The silver chain, her mother's chain, slid from her wrist. It fell to the wooden floor, landing without a sound she could perceive. A small, shining pool of lost dignity at her feet. She heard the laughter in her own way. The shame had its own unique echo, a deep, jarring rhythm that vibrated through her entire being. It was the sound of 100 boot heels stomping on her soul. She felt her face flush with heat, a burning wave of humiliation. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her feet were rooted to the floor. Just as quickly as it began, the laughter died. An awkward, heavy silence descended upon the church. Thicker and more suffocating than the laughter had been, people shifted in their pews, avoiding each other's eyes, suddenly ashamed of their own naked cruelty. The preacher stared at Thomas, his face a mask of disbelief and sorrow. Sheriff Pike, however, was still grinning, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. Baron Creed simply watched, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unchanged. He was an observer of human weakness, a chemist noting the results of a predictable experiment. And outside, unheard by the crowd but felt as a distant tremor in the earth, a small group of horses passed by on the main street. At their head rode Tazani. He reined in his horse, his eyes drawn to the unusual number of wagons and horses hitched in front of the small church. He glanced up at the simple wooden steeple, at the bell hanging silent against the bright blue sky. There was a stillness in the air, but it felt wrong. It was the quiet of a held breath, the silence that follows a crack of thunder or a cry of pain. He did not know what was happening inside that building, but his instincts, honed by years of reading the subtle signs of the land and the people on it, told him an injustice was taking place. Inside, Elena's hand, which had been clutching a small bouquet of dried desert flowers, went slack. The bouquet tumbled from her fingers, scattering brittle petals and lavender across the dusty floorboards. She stood perfectly still, a lone figure in white, trapped in a silent forest of staring eyes. The performance was over. The humiliation was complete. Into the thick, shameful silence of the church, a shadow fell. It stretched long and dark from the open doors, cutting a path straight down the center aisle. A figure stood silhouetted against the blinding white sun, a man whose presence immediately changed the air in the room, drawing all the stagnant energy toward him. It was Tazani. He paused on the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the dim, dusty light. The entire congregation turned as one, a collective gasp caught in their throats. He stepped inside. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt, practical attire that seemed to rebuke the stiff formality of the townspeople. As he walked down the aisle, the floorboards did not seem to creak under his moccasins. He removed the wide-brimmed hat from his head, holding it respectfully in one hand. As he drew near the altar, he slowed, his gaze falling upon the preacher. He brought his free hand to his chest in a gesture of acknowledgement, a silent greeting that conveyed more respect than any of the loud prayers that had preceded it. His eyes, sharp and discerning, then found Elena. He saw the tremble in her shoulders, the shattered flowers at her feet, and then he saw it, a glint of silver near the hem of her white dress. Without a word, he moved past Thomas Hale as if the man were invisible and knelt on one knee. The sight of the Apache chief kneeling on the floor of the Drywater Church was so profoundly shocking that several people in the pews actually rose slightly from their seats. He reached out and gently, with a reverence that seemed entirely out of place in the wake of such cruelty, he picked up the silver chain. He rose to his full height and stood before Elena. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. He did not speak. He simply held out his hand, palm up. The delicate chain pooled in its center. Her gaze dropped to the silver, and a single tear, hot and swift, traced a path through the fine layer of red dust on her cheek. Slowly. Tazani lifted his head and turned his gaze upon the assembly. His eyes swept over the stunned faces in the pews, over the smug sheriff and the calculating baron, and finally, they settled on Thomas Hale. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it filled the entire sanctuary. It was a low, clear tone, devoid of anger, but weighted with an authority that dwarfed every other presence in the room. They laughed when the deaf bride arrived. He paused, letting the truth of the accusation settle into the bones of every person there. The silence that answered him was absolute, a vacuum where their laughter had once been. He then looked directly at Elena, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Before his gaze returned to the crowd, "She is better than all of you." The words landed like a thrown knife, striking deep into the heart of the town's collective pride. No one moved. No one breathed. He then turned his full attention to Thomas, whose face had gone pale. "A man who does not keep his word," Tazani said, his voice dropping even lower, "is not worthy to wear a knife at his side." Thomas flinched as if he had been physically struck. He took an involuntary step backward. "At the front!" Sheriff Pike puffed out his chest, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol on his hip. He began to step forward, his mouth opening to bark an order. But before he could utter a sound, Baron Creed, who had been watching the entire scene with the placid curiosity of a theater critic, subtly lifted one finger. It was a small, almost lazy gesture, but it stopped the sheriff cold. Pike froze, his face flushing with fury, and retreated to his place. The Baron wanted to see how this act would play out. Tazani seemed to pay them no mind. His focus was now entirely on Elena. He could see the confusion warring with the shame in her eyes. Reaching into a small leather pouch at his belt, he withdrew a flat, smooth piece of pine wood and a small nub of charcoal. He knelt again, briefly, and in bold, clear letters, he wrote on the wood. He stood and held it out for her to read. "You are safe. I stand with you." Elena stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes read them once, twice. The simple, powerful declaration was the first act of kindness she had been shown all day. It was a lifeline thrown to her in a silent, drowning sea. A tiny spark of her resilient spirit rekindled in her gaze. The effect of this quiet communication rippled through the crowd. Some of the women who had laughed the loudest now lowered their heads, unable to watch. A young boy in the third pew, a child who had a severe stutter and was often mocked for it, looked at Elena and gave her a small, secret smile. He understood. He knew what it was to be judged for the way his body worked. Tazani then faced the preacher. "I do not know your laws," he said respectfully, "but among my people, when a person's dignity is stolen in public, it must be returned in public." The preacher, a man lost in a moral wilderness, simply stared, dumbfounded. "I offer this woman an honor marriage," Tazani continued. "It is not a bond for your God or a vow for your laws. It is a shield, a temporary declaration, here in this place, before these witnesses, that she is a woman of value, a woman worthy of respect. It is a way to give her back the honor that was taken from her." The proposition was so audacious, so completely outside the realm of their experience, that a murmur finally broke the silence. An Apache honor marriage, here in a church. It was unthinkable. But the preacher was looking at Elena's face. He saw the tear track on her cheek, the raw pain in her eyes, and the flicker of hope that Tazani's actions had ignited. He looked at Thomas, who was now trying to shrink away, his cowardice a palpable thing. He saw the truth of the situation, unclouded by ritual or dogma. He raised a hand to quiet the murmuring. His voice, when he spoke, was heavy but firm. "Before God, there is mercy." Thomas Hale stumbled back another step, his face a mask of utter humiliation. The tables had been completely turned. Sheriff Pike stared at Tazani, his eyes narrowed with a venomous hatred. This public shaming, this usurpation of his authority, was an insult he would not forget, but Baron Creed smiled faintly. This was perfect. Better than he could have planned. An Apache chief laying claim to a white woman inside the town church. The story would be a firebrand. It was the perfect excuse to incite the conflict he needed to clear the Apache from Blue Mesa once and for all. Tazani turned back to Elena. He offered her his hand. It was an invitation, not a command. Her decision. She looked at his outstretched hand, strong and steady. She looked at the faces of the townspeople, their mockery now replaced by shock and shame. She looked at Thomas, the small man who had tried to break her. Then she looked back at Tazani into eyes that offered not pity, but strength. Slowly, she raised her hand and placed it in his. Together, they turned and began to walk down the aisle. They did not rush. Their steps were measured and confident. They walked directly through the gauntlet of people who had come to see her ridiculed. Her head was high, her back straight. This was not an escape. It was a reclamation. She walked past the smirking cowboys and the gossiping women, their power over her broken. She was no longer the silent spectacle. She was a woman leaving dishonor behind, hand in hand with an unexpected champion, walking out of the dusty darkness of the church and into the bright, fierce light of the Arizona sun. The journey into Blue Mesa was a journey into a different kind of silence. The oppressive, judgmental quiet of the church was behind them, replaced by a vast, breathing stillness that belonged to the land itself. For Elena, it was not an absence of sound, but a world painted in light and motion. She heard the whisper of the wind as it bent the tall stalks of yucca, their spiny leaves dancing in a complex, silent rhythm. She heard the scuttling of a lizard by the flicker of its shadow against a sun-bleached rock. The heat that shimmered up from the valley floor was a visible vibration. A low, constant hum she could see with her eyes. The shadow of a hawk circling high above was a fleeting, silent story written across the immense canvas of the earth. They traveled for the rest of the day, Tazani leading the way. His movements economical and sure. The nights were cold. The sky a black velvet blanket punctured by a million tiny, brilliant holes. The stars seemed close enough to touch, their light a pure, clean thing that felt ancient and knowing. Elena, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, would watch them for hours, finding patterns and connections, creating her own constellations in the silent, cosmic ocean. They arrived at the Apache encampment as the sun was casting long, purple shadows from the mesas. It was not a place of sharp angles and fences like Drywater, but a community that seemed to have grown organically from the land itself. Wiki-ups of bent branches and hide clustered in a way that spoke of family and shared life. The people who emerged to greet them did not stare or point. They met her with a quiet, dignified curiosity. Their silence was not empty. It was respectful, a living thing that made space for her presence. An old man with a face like a dried riverbed, his eyes holding a gentle wisdom, came forward. Tazani introduced him with a series of hand gestures. Nalin, the elder. He nodded to Elena, a slow, welcoming gesture. A woman with keen, intelligent eyes and hands stained with the colors of desert plants approached next. Dostese, the healer. Her gaze was direct, assessing, but held no malice. And then a boy of about 14, with large, dark eyes, stepped forward. His name was Keshto. He did not speak. Tazani communicated. Not because he could not, but because he would not. The boy looked at Elena, and a flicker of understanding passed between them, a recognition between two people who lived in a world where words were not the primary currency. In the days that followed, a bridge of hands began to form between two worlds. Tazani became her patient teacher. He would use charcoal on flattened pieces of bark to write the names of things, then show her the corresponding sign in the fluid. Expressive language of Apache hands. Water was a cupped hand brought to the lips. Horse was two fingers making the motion of running legs. Elena, in turn, taught him the American manual alphabet, her fingers quickly and precisely forming the letters of her own language. She showed him how to watch her lips, how the subtle shapes of her mouth formed the words she could not voice. They would sit for hours, a quiet intensity between them, their hands moving in a silent, complex dialogue, building a new vocabulary that belonged only to them. One afternoon, Tazani handed her a cup of tea he had brewed from the pulp of a prickly pear cactus. Elena took a sip and her face immediately puckered. The brew was astonishingly bitter, a taste so sharp it felt like a punishment. She looked at him, her eyes wide with mock horror. Using the signs he had taught her, she formed a playful scolding. "You are trying to poison me." A rare, fleeting smile touched the corners of Tazani's mouth. He answered her with his own dry humor, his voice even. "It is bitter," he said, "so that we remember our vows." The light-hearted moment was a crack in the stoic armor of both of them, a small sign of a growing ease. That trust allowed for a deeper sharing. One evening, as they sat watching Doste grind herbs, Elena began to tell a story from her past. Using a combination of signs and the alphabet, she haltingly described her childhood. She told them of being a small girl and of the frustration of her family who did not understand her silence. She recounted an incident where her father, exasperated by her failure to respond to his repeated calls, had put her in the horse stable for the afternoon, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate, misguided attempt to teach her to listen. To her, it had been a terrifying experience, locked in the dim, dusty space, unable to understand what she had done wrong, feeling the vibrations of the horses stomping and knowing only that she was alone and being punished for a failing she could not name. When she finished, Dostese stopped her grinding. The healer came to her and, without a word, placed a warm, firm hand directly over Elena's heart. She held it there for a long moment. It was not a gesture of pity. It was a rite of healing, an acknowledgement of an old wound, a silent promise that here, in this place, she would be understood. Elena did not allow herself to be a guest or a burden. She made herself useful. Her hands, it turned out, were as skilled as her eyes. She helped repair a section of a horse corral, her knots neat and strong. She observed the way the women channeled the precious rainwater and helped dig a new, shallow trench. She even learned to assist the blacksmith, her keen eye for detail making her adept at spotting flaws in a newly forged horseshoe. Her quiet competence did not go unnoticed. A few of the younger warriors, who had initially regarded her with suspicion, began to give her nods of respect. She was not the helpless white woman they had assumed. She was a person of substance. The peace of their days was shattered when a scout returned from the direction of dry water. He brought news. Baron Creed was not waiting. Surveyors had been seen at the edge of Blue Mesa, driving stakes into the sacred ground. Worse, Sheriff Pike, using the incident at the church as a pretext, had begun recruiting men for a new town patrol. He was calling it a security measure, but everyone knew what it was. It was a war party in the making. The news settled a heavy tension over the camp. The threat was no longer distant. It was on their doorstep. That evening, sitting alone, Elena took the Apache dagger Tazani had laid aside. She ran her thumb over the smooth mesquite handle, over the carved clouds that symbolized honor, using the tip of a small, sharp stone. She carefully began to etch a new symbol below the clouds. It was a design of her own making, a combination of an eye and a hand cupped to an ear. It was her word for what she had been denied, and for what she had found here. It was the symbol for listen. She worked until it was perfect, a permanent reminder to herself that she would never again bow her head to the sound of laughter. Later, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon and the campfires were being lit, Tazani approached her. He looked at the dagger in her hands, at the new carving on its handle. He did not ask what it meant. He seemed to understand already. He looked at her, his expression serious, and then made a series of signs. "Tonight, the elders sit at the great fire. They will speak of the railroad. You will come. You will sit with us." It was not a question. It was a statement, an invitation to the heart of their community, an honor rarely, if ever, extended to an outsider. It was a sign of recognition, a declaration that her voice, silent though it was, belonged in their council. Elena looked at him, a profound sense of gratitude welling up inside her, and nodded. The whispers of war began not with a bang, but with the quiet, unnatural stillness of death. An Apache hunting party found the first of the cattle, 3 of them lying bloated under the relentless sun, their hides punctured by small, neat holes. There was no sign of butchering, no meat taken. It was killing for the sake of killing, a violation that felt deeply wrong. More were found the next day, closer to the lands of the white ranchers. The poison of suspicion began to seep into the soil of Blue Mesa. In dry water, Baron Creed fanned the flames. He hired 2 men, a pair of rough-looking riders known only as Rook and Crow, who drank their whiskey in silence and whose eyes were as empty and hard as river stones. He met them not in his office, but in a shadowy canyon miles from town. His instructions were simple: create chaos. Make it look like white settlers were being raided. Make it look like the Apache were growing bold and violent. The story of the chief and the deaf bride at the church was the perfect kindling. Now, all he needed was blood to make it burn. Sheriff Pike did his part with relish. He began fabricating evidence. A torn piece of a homesteader's shirt found conveniently near a dead steer. A footprint made by an Apache moccasin planted in the mud miles from where it should have been. He started making arrests, dragging in solitary prospectors and homesteaders on trumped-up charges of trespassing on Apache land, creating a narrative of escalating conflict. And he found a willing informant in Thomas Hale, eaten alive by his public disgrace. Thomas saw a path back to respectability, or at least to relevance. He began to listen at the saloon, to spread rumors, twisting every overheard conversation into something sinister, feeding Pike's campaign of fear in a desperate attempt to erase the memory of his own cowardice. A week into this simmering hostility, the camp's supply of salt was running low. Dostese announced she would make the trip to Drywater. Elena, feeling the oppressive weight of the camp's anxiety and wanting to be useful, insisted on going with her. Tazani was hesitant, but Dostese argued that 2 women buying salt was a sign of peace, not aggression. They would be a message that his people still sought normal relations. He reluctantly agreed, his eyes lingering on Elena with a concern she could feel like a physical touch. The moment they entered the town's main street, Elena knew it had been a mistake. The atmosphere had curdled. Men stopped their conversations to stare at them, their expressions no longer just curious, but hostile. The air was thick with a menace she could read on their tightened lips and narrowed eyes. They made their way to the general store, the silence of the townspeople following them like a predator. Inside, as they were paying for the salt, 3 men from Pike's new patrol entered. They were freshly deputized ranchers, full of whiskey and self-importance. One of them, a big man with a florid face, blocked their exit. "Well, look what we have here," the man said, his words forming with a deliberate, mocking slowness so Elena could read them. "The chief's woman, come to spy on us." Dostese stood protectively in front of Elena, her back rigid. "We have come for salt, that is all." The man ignored her, his gaze fixed on Elena. He took a step closer, his sour breath washing over her. "Must be real quiet in that camp of yours, with you around. Maybe too quiet. Maybe you are listening to things you should not be." Elena felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach, but she held his gaze, refusing to show it. She would not give him the satisfaction. Suddenly, the light from the doorway was blocked by a large frame. Tazani stood there. He had followed them, his instincts overriding his judgment. He did not look angry. His face was a mask of absolute calm, which was far more intimidating. He did not reach for the dagger at his hip. He simply looked at the man who was harassing them. The man turned, a belligerent swagger in his posture. "What do you want, Chief?" "This is town business." Tazani did not answer. He just held the man's gaze. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The store fell silent. The other two deputies shifted on their feet, suddenly looking less confident. The big man's bluster began to crumble under the weight of Tazani's silent, unyielding presence. There was a law in Tazani's eyes, an ancient code of honor that made the man's tin badge and loud voice seem childish and hollow. Finally, the man broke eye contact, muttering an oath under his breath. He shoved past his friends and out into the street. Tazani stepped aside to let them pass. Then he turned to Elena and Dostese. His hands formed a single, sharp sign. Home. The ride back was silent and heavy. That night, Elena sought out Tazani, using the piece of pine wood and charcoal. She wrote, "This is my fault. The trouble. It followed me here." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a deep, aching sorrow. "Maybe I should leave, to take the trouble away with me." Tazani read the words, his expression grim. He took the charcoal from her. "Trouble did not follow you," he wrote. "It was already here. You only showed us its face." But his words offered little comfort to the guilt that was taking root in her heart. She felt like a lightning rod, drawing the hatred of the town down upon these people who had shown her nothing but kindness. The next evening, the sky began to change. The familiar clear blue was slowly consumed by a sickly yellow-brown haze that advanced from the west. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. The wind died completely, and an eerie silence fell over the land. A silence so profound that even Elena could feel it, a strange lack of vibration in the ground beneath her feet. Then the storm hit. It came not as a gradual increase in wind, but as a solid wall of air and sand. The world outside the Wiki-Ups disappeared into a roaring, abrasive chaos. The wind shrieked, a sound Elena could feel as a high-frequency vibration in her teeth. The fragile shelters groaned and tore, the hide coverings snapping and ripping away. Dust and sand poured in, stinging their eyes, filling their mouths and noses. In the midst of the panic, Tazani was a point of calm. He shouted orders that were instantly swallowed by the storm, but his people knew what to do. He produced long ropes of braided leather, and they began tying themselves together in small groups, ensuring no one would be lost in the blinding maelstrom. Elena saw the terror on the faces of the children, huddled together, their small bodies shaking. She felt a surge of protective instinct that overrode her own fear. She could not hear the terrifying roar of the wind, only feel its rhythmic, pummeling force. To her, the storm had a beat, a cadence. She went to the children and, using firm, reassuring gestures, got them to hold on to a shorter rope. She placed her bare feet flat on the ground, closing her eyes, feeling the deep, shuddering pulse of the storm as it shook the very foundations of the earth. She began to move, not in a panic, but in a steady, measured walk, leading them toward the relative safety of a low rock overhang she had noted earlier. She was their anchor, her calm translating to them through the rope, her movements matching the deep, terrifying rhythm that only she could perceive. The storm raged for hours. When it finally subsided, it left behind a world transformed. The landscape was scoured and reshaped, the familiar contours of the land softened and blurred by new dunes of red sand. But the camp had weathered it. Everyone was accounted for, shaken and covered in grit, but safe. The ordeal, however, had frayed the nerves of some of the warriors. A small group, led by a young, hot-headed man named Kale, approached Tazani. Their patience was gone. They spoke of the dead cattle, the harassment in town, the encroaching surveyors. This storm, Kale argued, was a sign. The spirits of the land were angry. It was time to fight, to strike back before Creed and Pike destroyed them completely. Tazani listened, his face like stone. When they were finished, he spoke, his voice low and firm. "We will not be goaded into a war we did not start," he said. "To fight in anger is to fight foolishly. We will be disciplined. We will wait." Kale spat on the ground. "We wait while they steal our land and kill our cattle. Your discipline feels like weakness." The accusation hung in the air. a bitter challenge to Tazani's leadership, but the chief did not rise to the bait. He simply turned and walked away, leaving the angry young men to mutter in his wake. Later, as Elena was helping to clear debris, her eyes caught something half buried in a new drift of sand. It was a small, metallic object, dulled by the grit but glinting in the afternoon sun. She dug it out. It was a spent cartridge casing. As she wiped it clean, she saw a small, distinctive mark stamped into its base. A tiny interlocking C and M. She had seen that mark before. In town, on the crates of equipment delivered to the Creed Mining Company. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, silent drum against her ribs. This was not the work of settlers or ranchers. This was Creed's. She ran to find Tazani, the casing clutched in her hand. She showed it to him, her fingers tracing the tiny letters. She took her piece of wood and charcoal, her hand moving with a fierce urgency. She did not need signs or the alphabet. She wrote a single, damning word: Creed. Just as the weight of her discovery was settling in, another scout rode into camp, his horse lathered and exhausted. He brought dire news from Drywater. In response to the escalating Apache threat, Sheriff Pike had declared martial law. No Apache was to enter the town, for any reason, and he had issued a warrant for the arrest of Elena Hart. The charge was espionage. The trap had been sprung. She was no longer just a guest or a refugee. She was a fugitive. Tazani looked from the scout to Elena, the grim reality setting in. They had used her silence against her, twisted her presence here into an act of war. He took her arm gently but firmly. "We must go," he said, his voice low. "It is not safe for you here now." He led her away from the camp, toward a narrow, hidden canyon carved into the side of the mesa. As they entered the shadowed cleft of rock, they paused. They looked at each other, the setting sun casting their long shadows behind them. In that silent space, surrounded by ancient stone, they made a silent vow. They would not run. They would not hide forever. And they would not allow her silence to be the weapon their enemies used to destroy everything they held dear. The canyon Tazani led her to was a narrow fissure in the rock, a secret place known only to the wind and the hawks. Inside, it opened into a small, sheltered alcove, like a hollowed-out chamber in the heart of the mesa. It offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. Now bathed in the deep indigos and purples of twilight, a small, smokeless fire of dried mesquite wood provided a circle of warmth and dancing light. The wind, which had been a brutal force on the open plains, was now a soft, mournful sigh as it passed over the mouth of their sanctuary. The sky was a vast, dark cloth strewn with diamonds, so clear and brilliant they seemed to vibrate with cold, silent light. They sat in a comfortable quiet, the shared ordeal of the day stripping away the need for superficialities. Elena watched the fire, not hearing the crackle of the wood, but seeing the way the flames leaped and swayed, a silent language of heat and energy. She felt the warmth on her face, a welcome contrast to the chilling fear she had felt in the camp. Tazani reached out, his movement slow and deliberate, drawing her attention. He did not touch her, but gestured toward her wrist. She looked down and saw the silver chain, a small, tight band of metal she had put back on after the chaos in the church. It felt less like a symbol of dignity now and more like a manacle, a reminder of a life that had tried to chain her. He gestured again, a quiet question in his eyes. "May I?" She hesitated for only a moment before extending her arm to him. His fingers were warm and calloused as he carefully unfastened the small, intricate clasp. He worked with a gentle precision, his touch conveying a respect that was as palpable as the heat from the fire. He uncoiled the chain from her wrist. For a moment, she felt a sense of loss, as if the last piece of her old life, of her mother, was being taken away. But then, he leaned forward. He did not move quickly. Every motion was measured, giving her time to retreat, to refuse. He lifted the chain and, with infinite care, brought it up to her neck. His knuckles brushed against her skin, a touch as light as a whisper, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. He fastened the clasp behind her neck. The silver, now cool against her throat, felt different. It was no longer a weight on her arm, but a delicate, graceful adornment. It felt like it had come home. He did not pull away. He stayed close, the warmth of his body a comforting presence in the vast, cold night. He looked into her eyes, and in their dark depths, she saw not pity, but a profound and unwavering understanding. Slowly, he leaned in, and she met him halfway, until their foreheads were resting against each other. They stayed like that for a long time, the firelight flickering on their closed eyelids. She could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, a vibration that seemed to travel through him and into her. In that moment, they breathed the same air, their silent heartbeats seeming to fall into the same, quiet rhythm. It was an intimacy more profound than any touch, a vow exchanged in the space between breaths. After a long while, they drew apart. A small smile played on Elena's lips. She lifted her hands, her fingers moving in the firelight. "Are you always this quiet?" she sighed, a spark of her gentle wit returning. A rare, true smile touched Tazani's mouth. He looked out at the vast, peaceful valley spread before them. "Silence," he said, his voice a low murmur, "causes fewer wars." The shared moment of humor eased the tension, opening a space for something deeper. They began to share the stories that had shaped them, the invisible histories that defined their souls. Tazani spoke of his older brother, a man he had revered, who had been killed years ago in a skirmish with settlers over the rights to a spring that was the lifeblood of his people. He did not speak with anger or bitterness, but with a deep, abiding sorrow, a sense of duty born from loss. Elena understood then the source of his fierce protectiveness, his unwavering commitment to justice. It was a promise made to a ghost. Then, it was her turn, with signs and the slow, careful spelling of names. She told him not of a single event, but of 1,000 small ones. She spoke of the invisible wound that is inflicted not by a weapon, but by a laugh. She described the feeling of being in a room full of people, seeing their mouths move and their shoulders shake, and knowing that their mirth was at her expense. She told him of the loneliness of a world that equated silence with ignorance, of the constant, wearying effort to prove she was whole. When she finished, Tazani did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply nodded, his eyes filled with a deep empathy. He had lost a brother. She had lost a world of sound. Both were profound, defining losses. He reached for a piece of charcoal from the edge of the fire and found a flat, pale stone. In the dirt at their feet, he began to write. "If you wish to leave the sound of guns, we will go." It was a stunning offer, a promise of escape, of a quiet life somewhere far away from Creed and Pike and the encroaching railroad, a life of peace, just for the two of them. Her heart ached at the thought of it, the sheer, selfish beauty of such a promise. She looked at the words scratched in the dust, a path to a different life. But then she thought of Dostoevsky and old Nalin, of the boy Keshto, of a whole community of people who had shown her kindness and who were now threatened because of a greed that had entangled her in its web. She took the charcoal from his hand. She did not erase his words entirely. She knelt and, with her finger, carefully wiped away the second half of the sentence. Then, beside his offer, she wrote her own addition, her own unbreakable condition. "But justice must remain." He looked at what she had written, and a look of profound respect dawned in his eyes. He had offered her safety, a personal peace. She had chosen solidarity, a shared struggle. He reached for the dagger at his hip, the one with the handle she had carved. He drew it from its sheath and laid it on the flat rock between them, its polished blade gleaming in the firelight. The carved clouds of his honor and her symbol for listen were facing up, illuminated by the flames. It rested there, not as a weapon, but as a testament, a shared oath. They both knew the terrible risk of what she had chosen. If war came, a true, open conflict, there would be no place for a future between an Apache chief and a white woman from the town. Their fragile connection would be crushed between the two colliding worlds. But in her brave refusal to run, in their shared commitment to a justice that was bigger than their own lives, they found a deeper, more resilient hope. They sat like that for the rest of the night, the dagger between them, watching the stars wheel across the immense blackness. The rhythm of their shared silence was slow, lyrical, and deeply real. The highest peaks of their emotion needed no words. Trust was their language now. As the first hint of gray began to soften the eastern horizon, a new light entered their sanctuary. It was a pale, delicate yellow, the color of new beginnings. The sunlight poured into the alcove, chasing away the long shadows of the night. It touched their faces, warming their skin, and glinted off the blade of the dagger that lay between them. It was the color of hope, not a passive, gentle hope, but a fierce and determined one, forged in fire and shadow, ready for the dawn. Dawn broke over the mesa, and with it came not hope, but a grim resolve. They could not stay hidden in the alcove forever. A young Apache scout, moving like a ghost through the rocks, found them just after sunrise. He brought food, water, and terrible news. Sheriff Pike, in his sweep of the territory, had taken prisoners. Among them was the boy, Keshto. He was being held in the town jail, a silent pawn in a loud man's game. The news galvanized them. Their quiet vow in the darkness now had a sharp, urgent edge. Running was no longer an option. Hiding was a death sentence for the boy. They laid out the plan on a flat rock, using charcoal to draw a crude map of dry water. It was a desperate, three-pronged attack born from necessity. First, they needed the proof. That meant breaking into the Creed Mining Company warehouse, where the ammunition was stored and the business of the railroad was conducted. Second, they had to free Keshto from the jailhouse. And third, with the boy safe and the evidence in hand, they would force a public reckoning. They would not challenge Creed in the shadows where he was strongest, but in the open, before the eyes of the very people he sought to control. They moved under the cloak of the next night, slipping through the desert like two shadows. They approached the town from the south, where the new, unfinished railroad tracks lay gleaming under the moonlight. The warehouse was a large, windowless building that loomed beside the tracks, guarded by two of Pike's newly minted deputies. Here, Elena's silence became their greatest weapon. While Tazani melted into the deeper shadows, she crept forward, her soft moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. She positioned herself behind a stack of lumber where she could see the guards' faces as they spoke. They were lazy, confident. She watched their lips move, her mind translating the silent shapes into words. One was complaining about the cold. The other spoke of going to the saloon as soon as their replacement arrived. He looked at his pocket watch. "Another hour," he said. "A very long hour." They decided to make their rounds in opposite directions. A slow, predictable circuit that would leave the main loading door unwatched for a few precious minutes. Elena relayed the information to Tazani with a few swift, precise hand signs. They waited. The moment the guards separated, they moved. Tazani reached the door, his hands examining the heavy iron lock. It was a standard, mass-produced thing, not made for subtlety. He withdrew a thin, wicked-looking piece of hardened steel from his belt, a tool he had shaped for skinning game, and slid it into the keyhole. Elena stood watch, her eyes scanning the darkness, feeling the faint vibrations of the guards' footsteps as they moved away from them. There was a faint metallic scrape, a soft click, and the lock swung open. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of shadows, smelling of grease, raw lumber, and metal. Moonlight slanted in through gaps in the roof, illuminating stacks of crates and machinery. They moved quickly, their purpose clear. Tazani went directly for the ammunition crates, while Elena, holding a small, shielded lantern, searched for the office. She found it in a corner, a small, glass-walled room. The door was unlocked. On the desk, held down by a rock, was a large, leather-bound ledger. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. The pages were filled with neat columns of figures and names. And there it was, a separate section at the back, the writing hurried and less precise. Payments. To a man named Rook, to another named Crow. The sums were substantial, listed next to dates that corresponded with the attacks on the cattle and homesteaders. Beside the ledger was a rolled-up map. She spread it open. It was a surveyor's map of the railroad's path. It showed a straight, brutal line cutting directly through the heart of Blue Mesa, right through the Apache's sacred burial grounds. At the same moment, Tazani gave a low hiss. He had pried open a crate. Inside, packed in sawdust, were boxes of cartridges. He held one up in the lantern light. On its base was the small, interlocking C and M stamp. They had it, all of it, the motive, the means, the money. The entire conspiracy laid bare in a dusty, silent room. But as they gathered the evidence, they felt it, a new vibration through the floor, the rhythmic, heavy chugging of a locomotive. A freight train was pulling into the rail yard, its single, bright headlamp cutting a swath through the darkness. And with the train came new activity. Men shouting, lanterns swinging, and worse, from the direction of the jailhouse. They saw Pike and two of his men dragging a struggling figure. It was Keshto. They were putting him on the train. They had no time to think. They stuffed the ledger and the map into a leather satchel and slipped out the back of the warehouse just as the new shift of guards arrived at the front. The train was a long, dark spine of freight cars, slowly picking up speed as it prepared to leave. They were not taking Keshto to the jail. They were taking him out of the territory, silencing him for good. They ran, their legs pumping, the roar of the train a physical force against them. They managed to grab onto the ladder of one of the last cars, pulling themselves up onto the roof as the train lurched forward. The wind tore at them, a constant, howling force. They began to make their way forward, car by car, a dangerous, swaying journey in the dark. Ahead, on a flat car, they could see him. Keshto was tied up, a gag in his mouth, guarded by one of Creed's hired guns. Rook, Sheriff Pike, was nowhere to be seen. He had handed off his dirty work. As they approached, Rook spotted them. He drew his pistol, the moonlight glinting on the barrel. Elena ducked behind a ventilation shaft, her mind racing. Tazani was exposed, trying to find a clear path to the man. She pulled a small, silver-backed mirror from her pouch, a tool she used for signaling over long distances. She angled it, catching the light from the train's own lanterns. She flashed a beam of light into Rook's eyes. Just for a second. It was enough. The gunman flinched, momentarily blinded, and Tazani moved. He did not charge with a yell. He was a silent, swift blur. He closed the distance, and in a single, fluid motion, he disarmed the man and, using the gunman's own momentum against him, sent him tumbling off the side of the train into a thick patch of sagebrush. The fall would hurt, but it would not kill him. It was justice, not vengeance. As Tazani cut Keshto free, Elena looked ahead. The train was approaching a high wooden trestle bridge that spanned a deep, rocky gorge. And, on the far side of the bridge, silhouetted against the sky, were more of Pike's men, waiting for them. It was an ambush. The first gunshot sent a violent shudder through the entire structure of the car. Elena felt it in her bones. A sharp, jarring impact. Another shot rang out, and a splinter of wood flew past her face. The bullets hitting the heavy timbers of the bridge were creating a pattern of vibrations, a deadly rhythm that she could feel, that she could almost predict. Tazani pulled his rifle, taking cover behind a water barrel. "Take Keshto," he signed to her. "Get to the other side." But she would not leave him. As he fired back, she stayed low, watching, feeling. She could feel the rhythm of his shots, the slight pause as he worked the lever action. She could feel the jarring impacts of the incoming fire. Through the chaos, she saw a pattern. She crawled to his side, tapping his leg just as he was about to fire. She pointed, indicating the timing, the rhythm of their enemy's fire. "Reload now," her gestures said. He trusted her. He used the precious seconds she had given him to reload. A hail of bullets struck the barrel where he had been just a moment before. They had found their own rhythm, a synergy of sight and feeling. He fought, and she listened with her entire body, guiding him, protecting him, a silent partner in a deadly dance. They were nearing the end of the bridge, but they were pinned down. Escape seemed impossible. Then, below them, on the rough track that ran alongside the gorge, a new light appeared. A wagon, being driven at a reckless speed, its lantern swinging wildly. At the reins was Maudie, the saloon owner, her jaw set, her expression furious. She must have seen the commotion and, on some magnificent, cantankerous impulse, decided to intervene. "You tarnation fools," she yelled up at them, her voice a welcome, grounding force in the chaos. "Are you going to stand there and get shot, or are you going to jump?" Tazzani looked at Elena, a question in his eyes. She nodded, her face grim but resolute. He grabbed Keshto, and on a silent count, they leaped from the moving train, a dizzying fall through the dark air, landing with a bone-jarring thud in the hay-filled bed of Maudie's wagon. "You owe me for a new axle." "You hear me?" Maudie bellowed as she whipped the horses into a gallop, turning away from the bridge and back toward the distant, sleeping town. As the wagon bounced and swayed, the gunshots fading behind them, a moment of stillness fell between Elena and Tazzani. They were bruised, exhausted, and covered in grime. But they were alive, and they had the boy and the proof. Tazzani reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hay from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, a moment of profound tenderness in the heart of the storm. "You are better than all of them," he said, his voice low, his eyes meeting hers in the bouncing lantern light. They rode on in silence. They now had the weapons they needed to fight back, not just the ledger and the map in the satchel, but the truth. They would not wait for Creed and Pike to make the next move. They would force the confrontation. Maudie, bless her cantankerous heart, agreed. The big weekly market was the day after tomorrow. The entire town, the entire valley, would be gathered in the main square. That was their stage. Far behind them, Sheriff Pike stood at the end of the bridge, watching the wagon disappear into the darkness. His face was a thundercloud of fury. They had escaped. They had made a fool of him. He would not let it happen again. He turned to the rider beside him. "Go to the Baron," he snarled. "Tell him to hire every man with a gun between here and the territorial line. Tell him the show is happening Saturday, and there will be blood." Saturday morning in Drywater was a symphony of commerce and gossip. A fragile harmony played out in the main square. Farmers displayed their produce. Miners haggled over supplies. And ranchers traded news and livestock. But on this particular Saturday, a discordant note of tension ran beneath the surface. Sheriff Pike's new patrolmen, armed with rifles and an unearned sense of authority, were positioned around the square, their presence a string pulled too tight. Ropes had been strung to create a large open space in the center, turning the marketplace into an arena, and on the flat roofs of the saloon and the general store, 2 figures lay prone, their rifles catching the morning sun. Rook and Crow were in position. Into this tense theater walked 3 women. Elena, with Doste Se at her side and Maudie following like a battleship under full steam, made her way to a large, empty wagon bed that served as a makeshift stage. The crowd parted for them, a wave of murmurs and curious stares following in their wake. At the edge of the square, leaning against a support post for a cantina, Tazzani appeared. He did not hide. He stood in the open, his arms crossed, his face calm, a solitary, unshielded target. He was placing his faith not in cover, but in the conscience of the people. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the vibration of the crowd's shuffling feet through the wooden planks of the wagon. She held up the leather-bound ledger, its weight a solid, reassuring thing in her hands. She turned the book so everyone could see the neat columns of figures. Then, she lifted her hands. Her signs were not the small, conversational gestures she used with Tazani. They were large, broad, and imbued with a theatrical clarity, designed to be read from 100 feet away. Each movement was precise, a word carved from the air itself. "This book," her hand said, "holds the truth." Maudie, her voice booming across the square, began to translate. "She says this book holds the truth." Elena opened the ledger to the back pages. She pointed to the names, then made the sign for a bird, a crow, and then a rook, the chess piece. "The names of the hired guns, Rook and Crow, are in this book, paid by Baron Creed." "It is a list of payments," Maudie roared. "To the men on those roofs paid by Baron Creed to attack your homes and kill your cattle." A wave of shock and disbelief rippled through the crowd. Men turned to look at the rooftops, then at Baron Creed, who stood near the sheriff's office, a look of mild annoyance on his face as if he were dealing with a buzzing fly. Elena then held up the surveyor's map, letting it unroll to its full length. She traced the straight, brutal line with her finger. "This is the railroad's path," she signed, "through the heart of Blue Mesa, through the graves of the Apache." "And here is his reason," Maudie shouted, her voice thick with outrage. "A map of the railroad, cutting a line straight through the Apache's sacred land." The crowd was stirring now, the pieces clicking into place, the strange attacks, the martial law, the sudden escalation of tension. It all began to make a terrible kind of sense. Creed had seen enough. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to Sheriff Pike, but just before the signal could be relayed, Tazani pushed himself off the post. He walked calmly into the center of the arena. He stopped directly in front of Pike and held up the crate of cartridges they had taken from the warehouse. With a deliberate motion, he turned it over. The cartridges, each stamped with the incriminating mark of the Creed Mining Company, rained down into the dust at the sheriff's feet. The proof was undeniable, physical, lying there for all to see. Creed's face, for the first time, hardened into a mask of cold fury. This was not going according to plan. He lifted his chin slightly, a clear signal to the men on the roof. "Fire!" Across the square, standing near his parents, Thomas Hale saw the signal. He saw the cold, murderous intent in Creed's eyes. He saw the snipers on the roof adjust their aim, not towards Tazani, but towards the wagon, towards Elena. In that frozen moment, the entire shabby structure of his life, his compromises, his cowardice, came crashing down around him. He looked at Elena, standing tall and defiant, and for the first time, he saw her not as a broken thing, but as the strongest person he had ever known. He realized, with a sickening certainty, that he was standing on the wrong side of everything that mattered. The first shot cracked through the air, but it did not come from the rooftops. It came from one of Pike's deputies, aimed at Tazani. The bullet missed, kicking up a puff of dust, and the square erupted into chaos. People screamed and scrambled for cover. The carefully constructed harmony of the market day shattered into 1,000 pieces of panic. Tazani did not run. He immediately began to direct the civilians, his powerful voice cutting through the rising panic. "Get down to the wagons." His hands moved in sharp, clear gestures. And Elena, from her vantage point, saw what he was doing. She began to help, her own hands moving, not with words, but with direction. She saw a group of people trapped in the open and signaled a path for them, a rhythm of movement between the overturned carts. She became a silent conductor of survival, her mind seeing the geometry of the chaos, her hands creating pockets of safety. The gunfight was a maelstrom. It was a battle against Creed's hired guns, but it was also a battle against the very idea that had brought them here, the relentless, iron-willed progress of the railroad, a machine that would devour land and lives without a second thought. A stray bullet whined through the air and struck Dostoevsky in the shoulder. The healer cried out and crumpled to the floor of the wagon. The sight of her friend falling struck Elena with a pain sharper than any bullet. She dropped to her knees, ripping a strip of cloth from her petticoat and pressing it hard against the wound. Her face a mask of anguish. This was the cost. This was the blood Creed was willing to spill. She looked up and saw Tazani, firing from behind a water trough. She caught his eye. She reached for the Apache dagger at her belt, the one she had carved. She held it up, its blade catching the sun. Her eyes conveyed a single, desperate message. End this with the truth. He nodded, his face grim. At that moment, Thomas Hale saw one of the snipers on the saloon roof draw a bead on a small child who had fallen in the chaos. Without a single thought, Thomas drew the small pistol he had carried for appearances but had never fired. He lifted it with a shaking hand, aimed, and fired. The shot went wide of the sniper's body but struck his hand, causing the rifle to fly from his grasp. The sniper cried out and scrambled back from the edge of the roof. Thomas stood, his gun smoking, his heart pounding. A man reborn in a single act of courage. He looked across the chaos, and his eyes met Elena's. There were no words, no signs, but in his gaze, she saw a profound and complete apology. The tide had turned. The townspeople, seeing one of their own fire on Creed's men, were no longer just victims. A blacksmith and 2 miners, armed with hammers and pickaxes, charged one of Pike's deputies, overwhelming him. On the far side of the square, Maudie solved the problem of the second sniper. With a roar of fury, she tipped over a large barrel of whiskey from her saloon's porch, lit a rag, and rolled the flaming barrel against the side of the building. Thick, acrid smoke and flames began to pour upwards, forcing the second sniper to either jump or burn. In the midst of it all, Tazani moved. He broke cover, a blur of motion, and charged not the gunman, but the architect of the chaos himself. He tackled Baron Creed in the middle of the street, sending the man sprawling into the dust. He disarmed him with brutal efficiency, wrenching the man's fancy pistol from his hand. Seeing their leader captured, the last of Pike's men threw down their guns. The sheriff stood alone, his face slack with disbelief. The blacksmith who had led the charge walked up to him, his face dark with rage, and ripped the tin star from Pike's chest, throwing it into the dirt. The gunshots stopped. An eerie, ringing silence fell over the square, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whimpers of the injured. The townspeople slowly rose to their feet, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and a newfound, fragile unity. Elena, her hands stained with Dostoevsky's blood, climbed to her feet. She stood before the entire town, before the captured baron and the disgraced sheriff. The silence was absolute. Every eye was on her. She lifted her hands, and in the quiet that followed the storm, she spoke. "I may not be able to hear your voices," she signed, her movements fluid and filled with a profound, aching grace. "But I can see your hearts. Today, let your hearts listen to themselves." The crowd stood, utterly still, utterly silent. The wind picked up, swirling the red dust around her feet, but no one moved. They were no longer an audience watching a spectacle. They were a congregation, and for the first time, in the profound and total silence of the Drywater Square, they were finally, truly listening. The aftermath of the gunfight was not chaos, but a strange, focused calm. Justice in Drywater. It turned out, was a swift and practical affair. There was no formal courthouse, no bewigged judge. The trial of Baron Creed and Sheriff Pike was held right there in the square, with the blood still fresh in the dust. The jury was the entire town, their face grim and set. The blacksmith, his hammer still resting on his shoulder, acted as the assembly's voice. The evidence was laid out on the wagon bed where Dostoevsky was now being gently tended to by the town's doctor. The ledger, the map, the crate of cartridges. Each piece of the puzzle was presented not with legal jargon, but with the plain, hard-edged truth. Several ranchers and prospectors, men who had been bullied and threatened by Creed's agents, found their courage and stepped forward to speak. Their testimonies, spoken in the open air, were a litany of greed and intimidation. Creed, his fine coat covered in dust, tried to bluster and threaten, speaking of his connections and the power of the railroad. But his words were empty now. His power had been derived from the town's fear and division, and in the space of a single morning, both had been burned away. Pike, stripped of his badge and his authority, simply stood with his head bowed, a man hollowed out by his own corruption. The verdict was unanimous and unspoken. It was a collective turning of backs, a communal judgment that was more absolute than any gavel's fall. A circuit judge was due to pass through the territory in a month. Creed and his men would be held in the jail, under a guard of trusted townspeople, to await a formal sentencing that everyone knew was a mere formality. More importantly, a writer was dispatched that very afternoon with a copy of Creed's ledger and a letter signed by every prominent citizen of Drywater, addressed to the territorial governor and the railroad's board of directors. The message was clear. The route through Blue Mesa was closed. The line would have to go around. In the Apache camp, a different kind of justice was being administered. The justice of healing, endorse, thanks to the town doctor's swift attention and her own formidable constitution, had survived the worst of her injury. The bullet had passed clean through her shoulder, and while the wound was painful, it would not be fatal. As she rested, a quiet but profound ceremony took place. Nalin, the elder, lit a bundle of sacred sage, its smoke thick and aromatic. He walked among the few who had been injured in the fray, both Apache and townsfolk who had come to offer their help, wafting the purifying smoke over them. It was a ritual of cleansing, of washing away the violence and the fear, of mending the spirit as well as the flesh. Elena knelt beside Dostese, watching the smoke curl and dissipate, feeling the quiet, powerful peace of the ritual settle over the camp. In the days that followed, the change in Drywater was palpable. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of shared purpose, a fragile but determined community spirit. And at the heart of this transformation was a new sound, or rather, a new way of being heard. At Maudie's insistence, a class was started in the small, one-room schoolhouse. It was a class in sign language, and its teacher was Elena. Twice a week, the room would fill with an unlikely assortment of students, ranchers with calloused, clumsy hands, miners' wives, and a half-dozen curious children. Keshto, who had been quietly returned to the Apache camp, came to every class. He sat at the front, his eyes shining, and quickly became Elena's most adept assistant, helping the other children form the shapes for water, horse, and friend. The blacksmith, a man of few words and a big heart, took what he had learned and, using a hammer and chisel, carved Elena's symbol for listen into the main support beam of the town's small wooden bridge, a permanent public declaration of their new creed. One morning, the preacher found something on the steps of the church. It was a simple, unadorned gold ring, the one Thomas Hale had intended to place on Elena's finger. Beside it was a sealed envelope. The letter inside was not long. It was an apology, stark and unsparing in its self-assessment. It did not ask for forgiveness, for Thomas knew he had not earned it. It simply stated the truth of his own weakness and acknowledged the strength of the woman he had wronged. It ended with a simple sentence: "I leave to find a place where I might learn to be a better man." No one saw him go. Thomas Hale simply vanished from Drywater, a quiet departure that was its own form of penance. The spirit of this new language even found its way into the White Oak Saloon. Maudie, in a stroke of genius, instituted a new tradition. Every evening, for 1 hour at sunset, was silent hour. The rules were simple: no talking. All orders had to be placed using sign language. Any man who forgot and spoke a word out loud had to buy a round of drinks for the entire establishment. The hour was a chaotic, often hilarious pantomime of thirsty cowboys struggling to sign for whiskey instead of beer, of frustrated prospectors trying to tell a story with their hands and failing miserably. But through the laughter and the spilled drinks, Something remarkable was happening. They were learning, they were paying attention, they were, in their own rough way, listening. One evening, as Elena and Tazani sat by a small fire near the edge of the mesa, watching the lights of the distant town begin to glow, he turned to her. He held up his hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. Slowly, with the painstaking care of a man carving stone, his fingers began to move. E-L-E-N-A. He spelled her name, his large, strong hands forming the delicate, unfamiliar shapes. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. Did I do it right? She watched him, her heart swelling with an emotion so profound it felt like a physical ache. It was not a grand declaration, not a poetic vow. It was something smaller and infinitely more precious. It was the effort, the simple, beautiful act of a man learning her language, a name she had never heard spoken aloud. A tear traced a path down her cheek, followed by another. She was not crying from sorrow or from joy, but from a feeling that had no name, a deep and resonant gratitude for being seen, for being heard in the truest way imaginable. She smiled, a radiant, watery smile, and nodded. Yes, she signed back, perfect. The town and the Apache, now bound by a shared victory, decided to create a monument, not a statue of a man on a horse, not a plaque with a list of names. They built something different, on a low rise overlooking the valley, halfway between the town and the mesa. They erected a sculpture made from the weathered, silvered branches of a storm-broken cottonwood tree. They were arranged like the pipes of an organ, a beautiful, intricate structure designed to catch the wind. But it was a wind chime that made no sound. When the desert wind blew through it, as it always did, the branches would sway and move, a constant, silent dance. It was a reminder that the most important things are not always heard. That silence, too, could be a form of music. The season of healing culminated in a celebration. It was held in the schoolyard as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the proceedings. The children of the town, led by Keshto, had prepared a performance. There was no music. The children, both from the town and from the Apache camp, came forward and began to dance. It was a story told in movement, a ballet of hands and bodies. They told the story of a woman in a white dress, of a town's cruelty, of a chief's honor, of a fight in a dusty square, and of a community learning to listen. When they finished, the assembled crowd, a mix of every face from the valley, did not erupt in cheers. For a long moment, there was a profound, respectful silence. Then, as one, they rose to their feet, and they began to clap, not with sound, but with their hands. They lifted their hands high in the air and waved them, a silent, fluttering ovation, a forest of hands speaking a language of pure, unadulterated praise. Elena stood beside Tazani, her hand in his. She could not hear the applause that was not there, but she could feel it. She felt the deep, rhythmic vibration of 100 pairs of feet shifting on the hard-packed earth. The tremor of a standing ovation traveling through the soles of her shoes and up into her heart. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever known. The seasons that followed the trial were a time of quiet, deliberate construction, both of buildings and of bonds, on a gentle slope of Blue Mesa, overlooking the valley that now connected two peoples. A new structure took shape. It was not a fort or a trading post. It was a school, built of fragrant cedar logs by the hands of miners, ranchers, and Apache warriors working side by side. It was a simple, sturdy building. Its most remarkable features were its windows, which were large and wide, designed to let in the maximum amount of the bright, clear desert light. Inside, there was a single, large room. At the front, a wide slate blackboard was permanently fixed to the wall, and on that blackboard, written in Elena's neat, careful script, were the first and most important words of the school's curriculum. To listen equals to respect. This was Elena's classroom, but it was also the new heart of the valley. Here, she taught the children the alphabet. both spoken and signed. She taught them arithmetic and history, but more than that, she taught them the language of attention, the simple, radical act of watching another person's face and truly seeing what they meant. The children, unburdened by the hardened prejudices of their parents, learned quickly, their hands and minds nimble. They became the first true bridge, a generation for whom the silence of one language and the sounds of another were not barriers, but simply different ways of speaking the same truths. It was on a warm afternoon in late spring, with the cottonwood trees releasing their soft, white fluff into the breeze, that the second wedding took place. This time, there were no heavy church doors, no suffocating pews, no audience hungry for a spectacle. They were married under the vast, ancient branches of the largest cottonwood tree in the valley, a silent witness that had seen generations of life and death pass beneath its boughs. The entire community was there, standing in a wide, loose circle. Ranchers in their Sunday best stood beside Apache families in their finest beaded buckskin. Maudie was there, wearing a hat adorned with an impossibly large feather, and the blacksmith stood with his arms crossed, a rare, gentle smile on his face. There was no music. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves above, a constant, soft whisper that was the valley's own hymn. The ceremony was a weaving of two traditions. Nalin, the elder, came forward first. He lit a small bundle of sweetgrass, and its sacred smoke drifted up into the branches, a silent blessing to the Creator and the earth. He spoke in the Apache tongue, his words a low, resonant prayer for harmony and long life. Then the preacher from Dry Water, his face now etched with a humble wisdom he had not possessed before, stepped forward. He spoke the familiar words of his faith, but they were different now, stripped of their rigid formality and filled with a simple, honest meaning. He spoke of partnership, of shared burdens, and of a love that had been tested in fire and had emerged stronger than steel. Then the two old men, the elder and the preacher, stood side by side and together. They placed their hands on the heads of Tazani and Elena, a single unified blessing from two worlds made one. When it came time for the vows, Tazani turned to Elena. He looked into her eyes, his own filled with a love that was as steady and vast as the land around them. He spoke, and as he spoke, his hands moved, translating his heart into the language they now fully shared. "We will not be separated by silence," he said and signed, but brought closer by it. Elena's answer was not in words or signs. She turned and walked the few paces to the new schoolhouse. The dagger, the one with her symbol for listen carved into its handle, was at her belt. She drew it from its sheath. It was not a weapon now, but a promise. She walked to the wall just inside the open door of the classroom and placed the dagger on two wooden pegs that had been prepared for it. There it would remain, a permanent part of the school, a testament to the idea that true listening is an act of courage, that a true voice is not always one that makes a sound. It was her vow, a promise to dedicate her strength, her spirit, and her unique way of hearing the world to the future of this valley and its children. Their love was never about one person saving the other. It was about two whole people choosing to walk the same path. It was a companionship of equals, a quiet, steadfast partnership that drew its strength not from grand pronouncements, but from shared silence and unwavering trust. And the justice they had fought for had not been won with the loudest shouts or the most bullets, but with the simple, unassailable power of a truth brought out into the light for all to see. The future of the valley unfolded with the slow, steady rhythm of the seasons. The railroad, under new and more scrupulous management, was rerouted 20 miles to the south. It still brought change, but it was a different kind of change. It brought honest merchants and new families, people who were drawn not by the promise of quick riches, but by the reputation of a small, unusual town that was becoming known throughout the territory as the place that listened with its eyes and its heart. The sign language class grew, its lessons becoming as fundamental to a dry water education as reading and writing. Maudie, true to form, made a boisterous but surprisingly effective run for mayor. Her campaign slogan, painted in large white letters on the side of her saloon, was simple and to the point. Talk less, do more. She won in a landslide. The story of Elena and Tazani became a quiet legend, a foundational tale for the new kind of community they had all built together. The narrative voice of the valley, once so cruel and mocking, had found a new tone, one of simple grace. She was born without sound, but she taught an entire valley how to listen. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of deep, impossible purple, two figures walked hand in hand away from the schoolhouse. The desert air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Their shadows stretched long before them on the red sand. And then, as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, their two shadows merged and became one. The wind soughed through the silent branches of the cottonwood trees and whispered across the plains. A timeless, gentle sound. It was a wind that carried on it a promise that needed no words, a love that would endure in the vast, quiet heart of the American West. Thank you for listening to our story. Please feel free to comment with where in the world you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and show your support by pressing the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.